On the surface, Anatoly Moskvin was the kind of man you would probably overlook walking on the street. A quiet historian, big fan of books, quite eccentric, spending his days buried in research in Russian folklore and cemeteries. He spoke more than a dozen languages, wrote lots of articles, and was even considered a local expert on burial customs. But what nobody realized was that his knowledge wasn't just academic. For years and years, graves across his hometown were being mysteriously desecrated. Parents would arrive at cemeteries only to find the resting place of their daughter completely destroyed. Dug up, toys left behind, and sometimes even the coffin was empty. When police finally traced the pattern back to Moskvin and his apartment, they expected to find evidence of grave robbing. What they instead found was something that looked like a children's playroom. Rows of brightly dressed dolls propped up on chairs and beds. Only it wasn't dolls. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Sian and I make content around anything deep, dark, and disturbing. So if you're a fan of that, then you're definitely in the right place. If you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I try to post videos every week. So Anatoly Moskvin, by all appearances, was a man devoted to learning. Born in 1966 in the Russian city of Nizhny Novgorod, he grew up quiet and solitary. He very much preferred reading books to socializing with people. From a very young age, he showed quite an unusual gift for languages. By adulthood, he could speak over a dozen languages very fluently. He became a linguist, a historian, and a journalist, contributing to academic journals and local newspapers. To his neighbors, he was eccentric but completely harmless. He never married, never dated, and never seemed interested in the normal milestones of life. Instead, he lived with his elderly parents, filling his room full of books, papers, and clutter of an obsessive researcher. His specialty was quite unusual. While many scholars focus on politics, literature, or art, Moskvin completely immersed himself in folklore, funerary traditions, and the ancient rituals surrounding death. He spent countless hours just wandering through cemeteries, recording the names and dates on headstones, and learning the stories of those buried beneath the soil. To most, it just seemed like a quirky, even if slightly morbid, passion. Friends and colleagues described him as very odd, even awkward, but very smart and very brilliant. He blended into the background very well, just the kind of man people described as the local academic who just has a few unusual interests. But behind this facade of scholarship, Moskvin was nurturing something much darker. His obsession with the dead was no longer being confined to the page or the cemetery gates. It was beginning to spill into the real world in darker ways that even you could imagine. By the late 1990s, locals in the town that he was living in was used to seeing him wandering around cemeteries. Like I said, he would walk hours and hours through the overgrown paths, just taking notes of people's names, their birth dates, why they had passed away. He knew entire graveyards by heart. Who was buried where, which families visited, and which graves were simply forgotten. He even wrote long articles about his work, describing Russian burial practices with a mix of historical analysis and personal fascination. Moskvin actually claimed that as a child he had once been forced by older people to kiss the face of a girl lying in her coffin. That memory, of course, haunted him and probably traumatized him, and in adulthood it warped into a strange longing. At first, his cemetery walks were simply just about observation, but soon they became about contact. He began touching graves, lying on them, and eventually he started experimenting with them. Small items on the graves started to go missing. Toys, trinkets, and flowers. Families did begin noticing the strange gifts that he also left behind. Notes in an unfamiliar hand, little dolls, and even candy. Then came the desecrations, coffins being tampered with and graves being disturbed. Parents would arrive at the cemetery only to find their son or daughter's grave completely overturned, their child's resting place completely violated. The community whispered about vandals, satanic cults, or even just bored teenagers. But this was no random act of vandalism. Moskvin was learning, practicing, and preparing, and soon he would be bringing the dead home. By the late 2000s, the desecrations became way too much to ignore. Headstones were now being smeared with paint, coffins pried open, and the bodies of their children missing. The police, of course, began launching investigations because now people were grave robbing. But the cases just began piling up way faster than the police could solve them. At first, the authorities just suspected normal grave robbers, maybe looking for jewelry or other trinkets they could sell. Others whispered about occult groups, but something just didn't fit. Often the valuables were untouched, so grave robbers were out the question. And also, one gift was being replaced with another, so the person would steal some of the toys and trinkets that were originally in the grave and then leave behind some dolls and candy. The pattern was very weird and very unnerving, and almost all of the desecrated graves belonged to young girls. Investigators eventually traced footprints, and of course the locals started speaking about the lone man who would walk the graveyards. Very strange writings also began to appear in the local newspaper. These articles were pinned under the name Anatoly Moskvin and were very detailed guides to burial sites, folklore, and the history of cemeteries. In hindsight, they read less like academic essays written from a journalist and more like confessions. In 2011, police finally obtained a warrant to search Anatoly Moskvin's apartment. They expected to find some of the stolen artifacts from the graves and probably piles of notes from the cemetery research that he was doing. But what they walked into was one of the most disturbing discoveries in modern criminal history. Inside that apartment, the police uncovered life-sized dolls. There were dozens of them. At first, they looked crude but completely harmless. Strange, handmade creations dressed in children's clothing, propped on chairs and sofas. Some even wore wigs, stockings, or masks. Then the officers started to look closer. The dolls had human hands, human faces, and even human skin. These weren't dolls at all. They were corpses. The police officers, of course, completely froze. The dolls that filled Moskvin's apartment weren't stitched together from fabric or plastic. They were the bodies of the children that were being taken out of their own graves. In all, investigators counted at least 26 mummified corpses, though some reports say they were as many as 29. Each one had been very carefully preserved, dressed and altered to resemble a toy of some sort. Moskvin had wrapped the limbs in cloth to keep their shape. He even stuffed the bodies with rags to prevent them collapsing. He slipped stockings over their arms and legs and then dressed them in bright dresses, skirts, and even school uniforms. But it was the faces of these so-called dolls that were the most grotesque. Some were covered with painted masks. Others had on wigs and even layers of makeup. In several cases, Moskvin had even sewn in little button eyes, like something out of a complete nightmare. One doll even had a crude plastic mask with lipstick smeared across it. Another had a toy music box hidden inside its chest, so that when it moved, it would play a little music tune. These bodies were seated around the apartment like some sort of a collection. Some of them sat upright in chairs, some of them even lay tucked into his bed. A few were posed as if watching television. To the casual visitor, it might have just looked like a very cluttered, very eccentric home of someone who was passionate about dolls, until you realized that every single little doll had been a small girl. Moskvin later admitted that he sang lullabies to them. He even celebrated some of their birthdays. He called them his own children, his own daughters. To him, they weren't corpses. They were just companions waiting to be brought back to life. When investigators questioned Anatoly Moskvin, he didn't deny what he was doing. In fact, he just explained it in great detail, very calmly, almost academically, like he was describing a science project. He claimed he had perfected his very own technique of mummifying corpses. And bear with me on this, just a trigger warning, I'm gonna explain how he prepared his dolls. After exhuming a body, he would dry it out with a combination of salt, baking soda, and a few chemicals. And once the flesh was preserved enough to stop rotting, he would stuff the body with rags or padding to restore its shape. Then came the transformation. He wrapped the limbs in stockings to keep them all intact, and then he dressed the bodies in children's clothing, bright dresses, frilly blouses, tights, and on their heads he placed wigs. Like I mentioned earlier, on their faces there were masks made from plastic, wax, or even cloth. Some he decorated with makeup or paint. The goal wasn't to preserve them, it was to hide the fact that they were human remains. I think he just wanted to make them into something that looked like a doll. To Moskvin, of course, they were more than human remains and dolls. He treated all of them as living companions. And when asked why he did it, Moskvin said he believed that he was rescuing the girls from the cold ground. He thought that burying the children was cruel, and that keeping them in his apartment was an act of mercy. He even said that he hoped one day, through science or even magic, they could be revived. And when that day came, he wanted them to be ready for it. He wanted them to be dressed, cared for, and waiting like they would be adopted by him. So for him, it was preparation for something that could happen in the future. But of course, to the rest of the world, it was one of the most grotesque and chilling acts imaginable. When Anatoly did finally speak out about his crimes, he didn't sound ashamed at all. He sounded like a man who truly believed that he had done nothing wrong. He insisted over and over and over that he had never killed anyone. Every single one of his daughters had been buried long before he arrived. To him, that mattered. He was not a murderer, he was simply a caretaker. He just told investigators that he felt sorry for the children being left underground. He believed that he was rescuing them, giving them warmth, companionship, and clothing. He simply believed that if he had preserved the bodies long enough for science or magic to bring the dead back to life, there would eventually be a way to resurrect them. And when that day came, he explained that these children needed families. They would need homes, they would need someone to love them. He thought of himself as someone helping them prepare for that future, dressing them in clothes, keeping them close, and treating them like his own daughters so they would not awaken in fear. It was Moskvin's very calm delivery of this truth that made it all the more disturbing. He truly believed that he had this family around him in his apartment. And when asked why he chose girls specifically, he answered simply because they could love him like children love their father. And perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire story was that Moskvin was not living alone the entire time. For all those years that he exhumed the bodies, mummified them, and turned them into dolls, he was sharing the apartment with his elderly parents. And of course, their apartment was being filled with dolls, and to his parents, it was just Anatoly being very eccentric. They accepted their son for who he was, and making dolls was this passion for him, so they just accepted that they were going to be around the apartment. They claimed that they never actually realized what the dolls truly were. They never took a very close look or asked what these dolls were being made out of. They just said their son had a passion for making dolls, so they let it happen. Their son was a very smart boy, but also a recluse. So if he just had a hobby and a passion, who were they to question it? Imagine living in that apartment and eating dinner with a dozen figures sat silently around the table, not knowing that they were real corpses. For Moskvin's parents, it was just a little bit unsettling, but it was their reality and they wanted their son to be happy. Only when the police got to their apartment and took a closer look did the parents realize that those dolls were not dolls. They lived for years and years with death surrounding them and they had no idea. That is how well Anatoly preserved these corpses. When Anatoly Moskvin was eventually arrested in 2011, the news, of course, not only shocked Russia, but the entire world. The images of his apartment with the dolls propped up in chairs or laying in bed spread like something out of a horror film. Families who had lost their daughters were forced to completely relive the grieving when they learned that their child's corpse had been disturbed and the body stolen by Anatoly. But despite the enormity of all of his crimes, Moskvin never stood trial. Psychiatrics very quickly declared him legally insane, which he definitely was. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and deemed unfit to face a court of law. Instead of prison, he was committed indefinitely to a psychiatric hospital. To this day, Moskvin has never showed an inch of remorse. In interviews from the hospital, he repeated that he still believes he had done nothing wrong. He insisted that he had only rescued the girls from the ground, and one day they would be revived. For the families of his victims, of course, this ruling was devastating. They had hoped for justice, for some sort of trial to acknowledge the horror that Anatoly had been doing all of these years. And this man would sadly never see the inside of a prison. What made it worse is that there were later reports that the psychiatrists in the hospital were thinking of releasing him after a few years. Every time the possibility of his freedom was raised, outrage completely erupted. Families, neighbors, and the wider public insisted that this man, who had lived so comfortably among the dead, could never safely return to society, and I agree. If he was capable of doing this and truly believing that he had done nothing wrong, what else is this man capable of? So far he does still remain confined. But we don't know, maybe one day this man will walk free. This story is just one of those rare cases where reality feels more like a horror film. Can you imagine living in that house or just stepping into that house and seeing this horror around you? And this brilliant man, the scholar respected in his field, being slowly consumed by this obsession. So bizarre that it left so many families grieving all over again. I just think that it is a very terrifying tale and scary to think that this person was so obsessed with making dolls that he would take it that far. But let me know what you think about this story. If you've heard about it before, if you haven't heard about it before, I would love to know your take, and please drop it down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to subscribe and please like the video. It really, really helps my channel. And I will see you for a new video next week. Bye.